Gaius Caesar, known as Caligula, following the recent death of his co-emperor, Caligula was known as a noble and moderate ruler. His sole leadership was welcomed by the Roman citizens, and they were happy to have a fresh new start from the unfavored reign of Tiberius before him. Although he had been granted many titles, Caligula had very little practical experience with governing. Most of his youth had been spent either in the palace or with Tiberius on Capri, where he had grown up in an unhealthy atmosphere of constant plotting and paranoia. Nevertheless, he transcended the people and the army with his initial behavior. Today we will go on studying about what did the infamous Caligula achieve and what was his legacy, what were his thoughts and reforms, what was the meaning of his conduct, what made Caligula such a threat, was Caligula a good or a bad emperor, and what impact did Caligula have on Rome, what caused his downfall, and finally, does Caligula deserve this bad reputation?
Hello everyone, my name is Xiaoyi, and today I'm gonna present the part about what did the infamous Caligula achieve, what did he do, and what was his legacy. Caligula was the third emperor of the Roman Empire and the third emperor of the Julian-Claudius dynasty. He reigned from 37 AD to 41 AD. In 37 AD, Emperor Tiberius died on the island of Capri. Caligula was approved by the Senate and inherited all the powers of Tiberius and became emperor. Caligula is considered a typical tyrant of the early Roman Empire. When he was in power, he established a region of terror, defined imperial power, and acted arbitrarily and tyrannically because of his arrogance. He built many public buildings and constantly held various large-scale banquets, which caused the empire's finances to deteriorate sharply. Later, he attempted to elevate the financial crisis by increasing various exorbitant taxes, which caused resentment among all classes of the empire. In 41 AD, Caligula was assassinated by the captain of the guards, Cassius Caria. Although Tiberius named Caligula and young Tiberius as his co-heirs, the Roman Senate unanimously gave Caligula all the privileges of the first citizen. In the early days of his administration, he burned the previous informal documents in public to show that he was open-minded and unwilling to listen to informations. He carefully but not harshly reviewed the list of knights and tolerated those who committed minor faults. He abolished the auction taxes on items in Italy. He also plans to restore the citizens' assembly and return to it the power to elect state officials during the Republican period. He generously distributed 300 sesterces to each citizen twice, and twice hosted some tours banquets for the families of the nobles and knights. Caligula personally showed them he encourages all good examples. After that, he completed several public works in Rome, including the Temple of Augustus and Pompey Theater. In Syracuse, he repaired the long-destroyed city walls and many temples. He often organizes gladiatorial competitions, crowds competitions, and various state performances, and has won the general love of all the citizens of the people. Caligula fell seriously ill in October 37 AD. Soon after he recovered from his illness, he broke with the Senate class and launched a series of perverse policies and brutal rule. In 38 AD, the death of Caligula's closest sister, Julia, made his temperament more dramatic. The ruler of ancient Rome was regarded as a god only after death, but Caligula ordered the heads of the statues of gods transported from Greece to be removed and replaced with his own head. On an impulse, he suddenly had the idea of conquering Germany. So he immediately assembled legions and auxiliary legions from all over the province, collected taxes throughout the province, and raised various military supplies on an unprecedented scale. Expect from a king in southern Britain surrounding to him, he gave up the idea of marching before the real war. However, he personally led his troops to conduct military exercises in the Strait of Dover and then returned to Rome to hold a triumphal ceremony for himself. Caligula's decision made the treasure of 2.7 billion sesterces accumulated by Terrabus exhausted within a year. So Caligula came up with various ways to earn money. He cancelled the law that allowed Roman citizenship rights to be passed on to future generations, restricted the people of the provinces, and released slaves to grant citizenship rights only to the second generation. In order to increase the tax-paying pollution, he demanded that the people must include the emperor as an inheritance in their will. One of the donors, other which the will would be involved. He also acquitted in all kinds of false accusations and confiscated the defendant's property in court. Caligula even accompanied off the equipment in the place of August and Terrabus and sent the captain of the guard to collect taxes on all commodity transactions. In 40 AD, Caligula suddenly announced to the Senate that he planned to leave Rome permanently and move to Alexandria, where he hoped to be revered as a living god. The emperor's guardian, Captain Korea, persuaded his accomplices, including Marcos and Lucius, since Korea was verbally insulted by Caligula before at the noon on January 24, AD 41, when Caligula was going to have lunch and walked on the promenade of the court, Korea and other accomplices assassinated Caligula and also killed his wife Cassania and young daughter Julia. Caligula's body was cremated and failed to enter the tomb of August and the Roman cemetery, and his statue was quickly destroyed. For the Romans, they only hoped that the absurd force of Caligula's reign in the past few years will end as soon as possible. Although the Senate oversaw the destruction of his statues after his death, Caligula's colorful extravagance and brutality solidified his renown for more than 2 millennia.
I'm Sothea and I'll be explaining the thought and reform. Public reform in AD 38, Caligula focused his attention on political and public reform. He published the accounts of public funds which had not been made public during the reign of Tiberius. He aided those who lost property in fire, abolished certain taxes, and gave out prize to the public at gymnastic events. He allowed new members into the equestrian and senatorial order. Perhaps most significantly, he restored the practice of democratic election. Caligula lavished money and building projects, from the practical aqueduct and harbors to the cultural theaters and temples, to the downright bazaars. Caligula's effort met with their enthusiasm. He freed citizens that had been unjustly imprisoned by Tiberius and eliminated an unpopular tax. He also staged lavish events, including the chariot race, boxing match, plays, and gladiator show. He turned a military campaign into performance art. Caligula led military campaigns to the Rhine and the English Channel, hoping to follow in the almighty legacies of his fearless father, Germanicus. His first acts were generous in spirit. though more than likely political in nature. He granted bonus to the Praetorian Guard, destroyed the Tiberius treason paper, declared that treason trials were a thing of the past, would call it exile, and helped those who had been harmed by the imperial tax system. Caligula's religious policies was a firm departure from the policies of his predecessor. Under Augustus, the cult of the deified emperor and being established and promoted, especially in the Western Empire, and was generally the first organization established in any new Roman colony. Augustus proclaimed on multiple occasions that he was not himself personally divine. Caligula's reign saw the expansion of imperial court and imperial palace into the forum itself. Imperial duties and responsibilities that Tiberius had returned to the Senate were proclaimed as right of the princeps, and the power of the Senate were further restricted. Perhaps modeling his rule after the Hellenistic monarch, Caligula sought to make himself the center of the religious activity, as has been noted above. In essence, Caligula sought to take the Principate to its next logical step, a divine monarchy. The first, however, the complexity of Roman society and Roman politics demand that the facet of the first citizen be continued. Suetonius compared Caligula to Julius Caesar in the mind of the Roman Senate. The delicately balanced principate had become little more than the tyranny it had rid itself of a century before. Thus, much of the sensational accusation leveled at Caligula could be viewed as politically motivated attack against his character and his memories. It must be kept in the mind that the record that we have today of Caligula were all written by his political opponent and those most damaged by his attempt to enforce his absolute authority. I'm Sothea and I'll be explaining Plato theory. My name is Vinita and I'll be presenting about the meaning of his. After the unhappy years of purges and treason trial, Rome welcomed its new emperor. The youngest son of the war hero Germanicus, also known as Gaius Caesar, had grown up around soldiers, and his nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, had stuck. As a child, Caligula had suffered enormously. His mother had been exiled and his two elder brothers executed on flimsy treason charges. As the grown mascot of Rome's army and the only surviving son of a charismatic father, many hoped Caligula would breathe new life into Rome. At first, Caligula lived up to expectations. He brought back many people exiled by Tiberius and ceremoniously burned the records of the treason trial held by Sejanus. 7 months after taking power, however, Caligula fell ill. Although he recovered, he began to act very strangely. Was he mad or just pretending? Some believe that he suffered from epilepsy, but historians are divided. Dressed in silk robes and covered in jewels, Caligula pretended he was a god. He forced senators to grovel and kiss his feet and seduce their wives at dinner parties. Then his eccentricities became more murderous. He restored the hated treason trials of his predecessor, executing both rivals and close allies, including the heads of the Praetorian Guard, his own personal protection squad. At other times, his cruelty was more random. In one instance, he was about to sacrifice an animal as a sacred offering to the gods. He raised his mallet to kill the animal and brought it down hard. At the last moment, however, he turned and struck a priest standing nearby who died instantly. All this time, Caligula was spending vast quantities of money. His extravagance soon emptied Rome's treasury, which Tiberius had greatly increased.
Still spending, but now short of cash, he began blackmailing leading Roman families and confiscating their estates. In the 40 AD, he led an army north into Gaul, robbing its inhabitants before marching to the shore to invade Britain. Just as the army was about to launch its attack, he ordered them to stop and gathered seashell. He called these the spoils of the conquered ocean. Meanwhile, Caligula still wanted to become a god. The same year, he ordered his statue to be erected in the temple at Jerusalem. This would have been highly controversial in a region already prone to revolt, but luckily, Herod Agrippa, who ruled Palestine on behalf of Rome, managed to persuade Caligula to change his mind. His behavior was making Caligula seriously unpopular among Rome's elites. Plots against his life soon became commonplace. In the 41 AD, 4 months after he returned from Gaul, he was murdered by his closest advisor, including members of his Praetorian Guard. To prevent reprisal, they also killed his wife and daughter. Death, but certainly not more. Caligula was succeeded by his uncle Claudius, the most unlikely of emperors.
Hello, Professor. I am Mary, and I will be going over whether Caligula was a bad or good emperor and why was he seen as a threat. Caligula was a good emperor before his illness and abolished unnecessary taxes, improving infrastructure, public transportation, and gave aid to many who has been wronged by Tiberius, who reigned before him. However, there grew a period of insanity for Caligula. He acted in the ways we remembered him for today. Here are some of the absolutely crazy things Caligula did during his reign. Caligula built many temples for himself, forcing people to realize him as a god. He had affairs and sexual relationships with 3 of his sisters while in their marriage. He made his favorite racehorse a consul and had people come to have dinner at the palace in his name, where the horse would sit at the table with them. He also murdered many wealthy people who did not voluntarily give them their land and estates, and heavily increased taxes on every class. He publicly displayed laws, however, put them on a very high pole and printed them in very small prints so the public could not read them. He did this because he loved punishing citizens for crimes they did not know were crimes. During reign, he complained often of how boring and uneventful the times were, and prayed for a military disaster or a public famine for entertainment. During a gladiator match, he ordered for a whole section of the public to be thrown to the lions in the stadium, also for entertainment. It happened to be a prisoner or public offender during Caligula's reign. There was sure to be at least one special torture method just for the job, as Caligula has a fanatic of his department. He had many forms of torture and slow death, including burning alive, food amputation, forced amputations, constant stabbings, and psychological torture, which included a father having to watch his son be executed, then invited to a party to make fun of his execution. Next is the tub. A prisoner was sealed in a wooden tub and force-fed milk and honey. Over time, he would deficit to so much that eventually he would die of suffocation. Finally, was sawing in half, literally. Consequently, many people subject to torture by Caligula would commit suicide to avoid them. Now, 6 months after becoming emperor, Caligula fell very ill. Both the public and the government were concerned for his health. Though he recovered, the people of Rome found that he was not the same man, which was when he started to punish people. Caligula also suffered from epilepsy. Predictably, this greatly affected Caligula's mental health and gave him illusions of grandeur and even divinity. Not only did this period of sickness affect his rationality, but he also suffered from inability to sleep and horrifying nightmares. He never recovered mentally and became ruthless, wanton killer of Roman citizens, including even his family. No one was safe. He spent the treasury on lavish but useless spectacles and began killing senators and engaging in many other horrible acts. One controversial aspect of Caligula's behavior, often raised as evidence of his insanity, was his apparent desire to be worshipped as a god. There is some ambiguity in the surviving sources regarding his issue. It had always become customary for Romans to offer prayers to an emperor's genius, which might be thought of as a person's capacity or potential for divinity. But the worship of the genius is not the same as regarding that person as a god. Leaders would also be elevated to divine status after their death. Augustus had done this job for Julius Caesar and had erected a prominent temple in the Forum in Rome to the deified Julius. After his death, Augustus too had been declared a god. In the eastern selection of the empire, there was a long tradition of ruler cults. Kings were often given religiously tainted titles such as Soter or Savior. When these western areas were conquered by Rome, the ruler cult observances were seamlessly transferred to the emperors. But in the West and Rome, there was still a reluctance to view living emperors as divine. Concerning Caligula, some sources claim that he openly expressed a desire to be worshipped as a god and may even have truly believed that he was some sort of deity. He allegedly dressed as various gods, spoke to them as equals, and had temples to himself built. Whether these actions occurred or not, at the very least, when individuals wished to ingratiate themselves with Caligula by instituting calls to him or addressing him with divine titles, the emperor did not seem to encourage it. As additional evidence for his megalomania, Caligula routinely appeared dressed in a special all-purple toga decorated with gold palm leaves and clutched an ivory scepter which was surmounted with a golden eagle. This was an outfit that traditionally had been reserved for generals on the day they celebrated a triumph. Jupiter, the king of gods, was often envisioned in the same garb, further suggesting Caligula saw himself as divine.
Hello, I'm Mike, and I'm going to be talking about what impacts did Caligula have on Rome and what caused its downfall. In March 37 AD, Tiberius fell ill. He died a month later, and rumors swirled that Caligula had smothered him. It didn't matter. Romans were ecstatic over his death, in parts because the empire now fell into the hands of Caligula, whom citizens believed packed the same qualities as his esteemed late father. The Roman Senate fell right in line, naming a 24-year-old Caligula who had no experience in government, diplomacy, or war as sole emperor of Rome. For a time, Caligula's effort met with their enthusiasm. He freed citizens that had been unjustly imprisoned by Tiberius and eliminated an unpopular tax. He also staged lavish events, including chariot races, boxing match plays, and gladiator shows. However, 6 months into his rule, Caligula fell severely ill. For nearly a month, he hovered between life and death. In October of 37 AD, he recovered, but it was quickly apparent that he was not the same person. Tortured by headaches, Caligula wandered the palace at night. He abandoned the customary toga for silken gowns and often dressed as a woman. In addition, Caligula flaunted his power, eliminating his political rivals and forcing parents to watch the execution of their sons. Most egregious, however, was Caligula's declaration that he was the living god, ordering a bridge to be built between his place and the temple of Jupiter so that he could have consultations with the deity. Not even marriage and the birth of a daughter seems to change him. During these 6 months in power, he did the following good things: gave hefty bonuses to the army and the Praetorian Guard, restored many dilapidated temples to their former glory in Rome. He cancelled the treason trials instituted by Tiberius and allowed those in exile to come back to Rome. Caligula's profligacy was draining the Rome treasury faster than he could replenish it through taxes and exhaustion. A conspiracy formed between the Praetorian Guard and the Senate and the Equestrian Order, and in the late January of 41 AD, Caligula was stabbed to death along with his wife and daughter by officers of the Praetorian Guard led by Caesar's Xiaoyi. Thus, critics do note Caligula leaned by the actual experience that he was not a god. The Senate attempted to use the disastrous end of Caligula's reign as a pretext to re-establish the Roman Republic, but Claudius and the heir designated took the throne after gaining the support of Praetorian Guard. The Julio-Claudian dynasty would remain secure for another 17 years until Nero's suicide in 68. Rome soon grew to hate its leader, and citizens began to secret push to get rid of him. On January 24, 41 AD, Caligula was attacked by a group of guardsmen following a sporting event. During the assassination, Caligula was stabbed 30 times and killed. His body was dumped into a shallow grave, and his wife and daughter were murdered. Caligula's death pushed Disney to immediately order the destruction of a statue in hopes of eradicating him from the Rome's history. Still, more than 2 millennia since his rule, Caligula's legacy is deemed a fascinating piece of Roman history. I'm May, and I'm going to be
Hello, Professor. My name is Vireak, and I'll be talking about does Caligula deserve his bad reputation? Our modern idea of tyranny was born 2,000 years ago. It is with the reign of Caligula, the third Roman emperor, assassinated in 41 AD, before he had reached the age of 30, that all components of bad autocracy came together for the first time. Of course, there had been some very nasty monarchs and despots before Caligula, but so far as we know, none of his predecessors had ever ticked all the boxes fully fledged tyrant in the modern sense. There was his passion for shoes, his megalomania, sadism, sexual perversion, to the sadly odd relationship with his pet. One of his bright ideas was supposed to have been to make his favorite horse a consul, the chief magistrate of Rome. Roman writers went on and on about his appalling behavior and became so much the touchstone of tyranny for them that one unpopular emperor, half a century later, was nicknamed the Bull Caligula. It is probably too skeptical to mistrust everything that we are told. Against all expectations, one Cambridge archaeologist thinks he may have found traces of the vast bridge that Caligula was supposed to have built between his own palace and the temple of Jupiter. So it was easier for him to go and have a chat with the god when he wanted. So the idea that Caligula was a nice young man who has simply had a very bad press doesn't sound very plausible. All the same, the evidence of Caligula monstrosity isn't quite as clear cut as it looks at first sight. There are a few eyewitness accounts of parts of his reign, and none of them mention any of the worst stories. 3rd century historian Cassius Dio was convinced that Caligula deranged and continued and act madman in every way. What else could explain his deadly ranges and cruel whims? Seneca, who knew and crossed rhetorical swords with Caligula and survived to tell the tale, did not write Caligula insane acts. Equally, as German scholar Aloy Winterling points out, Seneca also accused Alexander the Great of acting insanely at times, just as he accused Roman women of the insanity of wearing too much jewelry. In fact, Seneca was of the opinion that Caligula was merely wicked. I think nature produced him as an example of the effect of supreme wickedness in supreme position, Seneca told his mother.